Conservative Party members have spoken. They're not ready for Rishi, as Liz Truss becomes the UK's new Prime Minister, replacing Boris Johnson by winning the Conservative Party leadership votes. She beat Rishi Sunak quite convincingly by more than 20,000 votes. And this result was quite expected. Even Rishi Sunak termed himself as the underdog despite winning all the five previous rounds until coming to the final vote, which involved all the party members. So this is going to be an extremely testing time for Liz Truss the next 2 years in particular, because the UK is in an extremely volatile situation when we look at their domestic affairs, and the world around is also quite volatile. We see things like the Ukraine war, the Taiwan conflict, etc. So it will be interesting how Liz Truss will navigate all of these aspects. But firstly, her main duty will be to navigate through the domestic policies, because it's quite clear that people aren't happy with the cost of living crisis, as in any country in the world that is facing a cost of living crisis and a high rate of inflation at the moment. So in this video, let's dissect two aspects, right, of what Liz Truss's leadership entails for the UK. Firstly, let's look at a domestic policy, and secondly, let's look at a foreign policy. When we look at the domestic policies, we see that one of the campaign promises was to cut taxes. So this comes not as a surprise, because in many elections we see people saying that they're going to cut taxes, and ultimately people vote for that because cutting taxes looks appealing for the voters, right? But let's look at the logical point of view that she said that the reason she gave as to why she's going to actually cut these taxes. The case is basically economic growth. When you cut taxes, people have more disposable income. They spend it on the economy, they spend it on SMEs and businesses, and ultimately increase the money circulation, and ultimately it results in economic growth. But at this same time, we have to understand that there are quite a few drawbacks when we look at tax cuts. I understand the reason why she wants to ensure increased economic growth, because when we look at G7 countries as a whole, the UK's growth rate for the next annual year is just 0.5%, which is one of the lowest when compared to the other G7 countries. So the UK is not in a extremely positive situation right now. Economically, India just beat them as the fifth largest economy in the world, and therefore I understand the mindset in which she desires to cut taxes. But at the same time, this is going to be quite hurtful in terms of things like subsidies and funding and investment. We look at the COVID-19 pandemic, and we look at the severe lack of funding for the NHS, and therefore cutting taxes is just going to reduce funding towards important aspects like healthcare, like education, that are extremely important, because after all, the government makes less income when you cut taxes. And also another aspect is that this can backfire on her, right? Because of the fact that sometimes when you cut taxes, rather than spending it and allowing the economy to blossom, people might go and dump it in the banks and basically try to save money, right? There's a clear case study when we look at Sri Lanka, where the government cut taxes in the hope that people would invest in the economy and ultimately help it grow. But people preferred to save it, and the rest is history. We know what happened to the Sri Lankan economy as a whole. Another aspect is that when we look at economic growth and inflation, there's a clear trade-off. So inflation is at an all-time high now. It's at 10% at the moment in the UK, and you could expect it to rise. There's a global inflation crisis, basically, right? So by cutting taxes, it's going to allow people to have more disposable income, allow people to spend more, and this at the same time, yes, it will help the economy grow, but at the same time, it could come at the cost of severe inflation. But I don't think at the moment, for economic growth, you want to be alleviating and increasing inflation as a whole, because we know how dangerous inflation can be. It's like a parasite, basically. And therefore, yes, I do understand the fact that you want to grow the economy, but inflation is something that you also have to keep under control. You can't just be increasing interest rates to keep inflation under control. And these tax cuts are basically going to allow people to spend more, and goods are ultimately going to rise in prices. Another key aspect that Rishi Sunak wanted to actually increase taxes, or just not reduce taxes at least, was the fact that the UK is under severe debt, right? They spent a lot of money when we look at the COVID-19 pandemic for the NHS and all. And one of his main campaign uh, slogans was the fact that you don't want this debt to be carrying on from generation to generation, which was quite an understandable thing. But Liz Truss believes that debt is not the most important thing to be paying off at the moment. But you can understand what Rishi Sunak is, from where Rishi Sunak is coming from. You want to finish off uh, uh, and immediately seize debts that are pre-existing, because you don't want that debt ceiling to be climbing, and future generations to have to basically have to tolerate the burden of the debt that was imposed by previous generations. This could, in the future, once again, negatively affect things like economic growth, right? A key aspect that we can see the rising of prices is energy bills. So this is a clear area that Listas will have to basically register, because energy bills are rising. She has basically stopped, uh, brought a cease to payments of energy bills, but it's basically a short-term thing. And this is clearly linked to the Ukraine-Russia war. Russia is not going to give you gas anymore to European countries. Therefore, it's only going to increase the prices of energy is only going to increase, and at the same time there could be blackouts and things like that uh, coming towards winter. So Liz Truss has promised that such things won't happen, but if there's no gas, if there's no gas to basically make energy, how are you going to basically create energy, and what is your long-term solution to actually settle the rising prices of energy? Because that's a key aspect that was not clearly answered when we look at campaign debate. Therefore, Truss's economic and domestic policies are mostly centered around cutting taxes. So let's look at how effective this is going to be when dealing with the cost of living crisis as well as the rising inflation in the UK. But in my opinion, I don't see this being extremely prosperous, because, after all, we've seen tax cuts in many other countries, particularly when we look at the Sri Lankan context. I know it's a developing country, but tax cuts, after all, do end up backfiring on the government. Because, after all, the government needs revenue to deal with things like debt, to deal with things like expanding the economy through infrastructure projects or health projects, things like that. So a government needs revenue, and the only way they're going to get revenue is through taxes primarily. So in the next video, let's look at Liz Truss's foreign policy, right? Let's look at how the UK's relations with other countries are going to develop, particularly with the two blocks, particularly with the Eastern Bloc composing of Russia, China, as well as India. And let's look at how her relations with things like the NATO countries, as well as the Western Bloc led by the USA, is going to prosper.